The deal was settled on a Saturday morning in October of 1969, in the parking lot of the feed store on Route 11 in Granger County, Tennessee. Virgil Rhodes drove up in his truck, a 1961 Ford F-100. Two-wheel drive, straight six. The blue paint faded nearly to gray. He drove home on foot. He was 38 years old, had been working the same 90 acres of hill land in Granger County since 1958. His father had signed the deed over and moved in with his sister in Bean Station. 11 years of working ground that had once grown tobacco and corn. Ground that had been let go so long that the middle 50 acres was thorn thicket and broom sedge and scrub locust. Dense enough that a man couldn't walk through it without a brush axe. He needed that 50 acres cleared. Couldn't afford the equipment to do it. What he had was the truck. What he was trading it for was 6 crossbred gilts, about 5 months old, from a man named Claude Tipton, who raised hogs on a creek bottom farm near Washburn. Tipton had looked at the F-100 twice, kicked the tires, said it was worth about what 6 good gilts were worth and they could call it square. They shook on it. Virgil walked the 6 gilts home on a lead rope. 4 miles on the county road. The gilts didn't care for the road much and required persuasion at intervals. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. 3 different vehicles slowed on the way. Men he knew. He didn't stop to explain. Word got back to the feed store by Monday. The men who'd seen him on the road told it the way it had happened. He was walking a lead rope with the 6 squealing gilts spread across the gravel at irregular intervals, headed northeast on Route 11 in the direction of his farm. He hadn't looked embarrassed, hadn't offered an explanation to any of them, just kept walking and persuading. The gilts didn't care about the audience either. They had a destination. So did he. The consensus at the Granger County feed store that October was that Virgil Rhodes had lost his mind. A man trades his truck for hogs, he's either drunk or desperate. The truck wasn't much, but it was transportation. 6 5-month-old gilts were going to be pork by spring at best. A sow operation at worst. Neither one was going to clear 50 acres of thorn thicket. That was the accepted wisdom. The man who drove the Republic feed route said he'd heard everything now. The man who ran the Purina dealership out of Rutledge said Virgil would be buying that truck back inside of a year. He wasn't wrong about most of it. Just wrong about what the hogs were for. Virgil had read about hog clearing in a USDA bulletin he'd picked up at the extension office in Rutledge in the spring of 1969. The bulletin was Agricultural Use Bulletin number 47, titled Swine in Pasture and Brushland Reclamation. It was 12 pages. He'd read it twice and underlined 8 passages with a pencil. Then read it a third time and underlined 2 more. The relevant principle was straightforward. Hog's root. It is their nature and their purpose. A hog left in brushy ground will turn the soil, tear out root systems, eat the tender shoots of young brush. In the process, it breaks the sod mat that holds established thorn and broom sedge in place. Properly managed, a small herd could work ground that a tractor couldn't reach. The key word was managed. Virgil had figured the management out before he ever drove to Tipton's place. He'd walked the 50-acre thicket 3 times in August and September of 1969. Forced his way through with a brush axe each time. Took notes on a folded piece of paper in his shirt pocket. He divided the thicket in his mind into 9 sections, not perfectly equal. Shaped by the terrain, 2 draws ran through the ground east to west, and the heaviest thorn concentration was in the low area between them. He paced each section and estimated the acreage. The smallest was 4 acres, the largest was 8. His plan was to fence each section separately with a single strand of electric wire. Move the hogs through in sequence, section by section. Give each area 6 to 8 weeks of working before moving the herd. The electric fence wire he already had, 400 yards of it left from a cattle rotation he'd run in the mid-1960s. He had a fence charger. He had corner posts. What he needed was the hogs. He built the first section of fence before he made the trade. Ran the wire from the barn lot corner out to the first draw, following the terrain. 3 days of post setting and wire stringing in September, working alone in the mornings before the day got hot. The enclosure covered 6 acres of the heaviest locust and thorn on the upper slope. He put a galvanized water trough at the low end and ran a gravity line from the spring box on the hill. Everything was ready when the gilts arrived. He put them in the first section on a Monday morning in late October, all 6. The enclosure gate was a gap in the wire he closed behind them with a wooden post. The gilts walked the perimeter first, noses to the ground, reading the fence. Found the water trough within the first hour. Found the first patch of thorn root within 2 hours after that. He watched from the fence line as they worked, noses down, turning the soil in the loose areas first, then working toward the heavier growth where the locust had been established longest. Hogs don't think about the work the way a man does. They think about what's under the ground. Grubs, roots, anything edible. The thinking takes care of the clearing. A single gilt will turn roughly 4 to 6 square feet of soil per hour of active rooting on good ground. On the heavy clay of the upper slope, with the root mat fighting back, it was less. But there were 6 of them, and they worked most of the daylight hours. By the end of the first week, they had turned maybe a 1/4 acre of soil in the upper section. Not impressive by the measure of a bulldozer. Impressive by the measure of something that fed itself on what it found and required no fuel except corn and water. He checked the electric fence every morning, 1 strand low to the ground. The gilts tested it twice in the first week. After the second test, they stopped testing it. He'd set the charger to push 6,000 volts at low impedance, enough to get their attention without doing harm. A hog that respects a fence is a hog that works the ground inside it. He supplemented their feed with corn, about 2 pounds per animal per day, thrown in the afternoon when he walked the fence line. He kept a count in a notebook. Feed cost, first month, $4.80 in corn. Second month, $5.40, as the weather got cold and they needed more to maintain weight. He was tracking expenses the way his father had taught him to track everything, in a composition book with a date on every entry. The first section took 9 weeks. By mid-January of 1970, the 6 acres of the upper slope were turned. Not clean, not ready to plant. But the root mat was broken in most of it, and the locust crowns were exposed or torn out. He moved the hogs to the second section the 3rd week of January and let the first section rest. What happened in the first section over the spring was what the USDA bulletin had promised. What Virgil had understood before he ever read the bulletin. Disturbed soil, left to itself in March and April, goes to annual weeds first. Chickweed, common ragweed, some henbit. The annuals had shallow roots and no woody crowns. They didn't fight the way the thorn had fought. He ran a disc harrow over the first section in April. Borrowed it from his neighbor Raymond Sells for 2 days. The turned soil came up clean. He planted it in sorghum Sudan on April 28th as a cover crop and soil builder. By June, the first 6 acres were green. The rest of the county didn't notice immediately. These things don't announce themselves. What a neighbor sees from the road is a fence line and some activity he can't quite make out. What Virgil knew was that the hogs were through their second section by March of 1970 and into their third by May. Moving faster now. The second section had been lighter brush, more broom sedge than thorn. and the gilts had worked it in 6 weeks instead of 9. He got his first litter in March of 1970. 2 of the gilts had been bred before the trade. Tipton hadn't mentioned it, maybe hadn't known, maybe figured it was a bonus. The first litter was 7 pigs. 5 survived to weaning. He kept 3 back and sold 2 to a man in Bean Station for $14 each. The $28 covered nearly 6 months of corn feed. He kept breeding records in the same composition book as the feed costs. First litter, March 14, 1970. 7 born, 5 to weaning. Sold 2 at $14 each, kept 1 gilt and 2 barrows. He didn't name the hogs. He numbered them. By the fall of 1970, the herd had grown to 11 animals across 4 generations of the original 6. 11 hogs working through sections 4 and 5 simultaneously, which Virgil had fenced as a connected unit because the terrain allowed it. The combined section covered 9 acres and included the worst of the 2-draw-low area he'd flagged as the most difficult ground. It was difficult. The root mass in the draw bottoms was interlaced 3 feet deep in places. Blackberry and greenbrier and locust all tangled. The hogs worked it for 12 weeks before he moved them. When he walked it in January of 1971, the ground looked like it had been plowed by something without much concern for leaving anything in rows. Good. That was the idea. He got his first cutting of hay from sections 1 through 3 in the summer of 1971. Not a heavy cutting. The sorghum Sudan cover from 1970 had winter killed, as intended, and he'd overseeded with a fescue and red clover mix in early March of that year. The fescue was thin and the clover was patchy. He cut 18 small square bales off 6 acres in July. Stacked them in the barn under a tarp. Thin yield. But hay from ground that had been thorn thicket 2 years earlier. Raymond Sells came by in July to pick up his disc harrow. Virgil had borrowed it again in the spring. He saw the hay in the barn. Stood there for a moment. Didn't say anything about the hogs. Didn't say anything about trading the truck. Just looked at the hay and said the clover looked like it might thicken up next year. He was right. The clover thickened in 1972. The fescue filled in between it. By the summer of 1972, Virgil was cutting 60 small square bales off the reclaimed sections. He used his father's old New Holland baler, kept running with replacement parts from the dealer in Rutledge. By 1973, it was 90 bales. He stacked them in the barn and along the south wall of the machine shed. Bales wedged 4 deep under the overhang. The sweet smell of cured clover in the August heat. Enough hay to winter 4 beef cows. He'd been thinking about cattle since 1971. Hay ground was cattle ground. He'd known it before the first terrace of broom sedge was turned. Hadn't let himself say it aloud until the hay was in the barn. He drove to the sale barn in Morristown in November of 1973. Bought 4 Hereford heifer calves at $88 each. Total outlay, $352. He loaded them in the back of the Chevy with board sides he'd built for the purpose. Drove them home on a Thursday afternoon. Turned them into the south pasture, which had been producing hay for 2 seasons and was rested and ready for grazing. The hogs had bought the cattle ground, without costing him a thing beyond corn and time. Nobody at the feed store said much about it one way or the other. That was how it worked in Granger County. A man did something foolish and people talked about it until he either failed or didn't. If he didn't, they found something else to talk about. Virgil had bought the gilts in October of 1969. By the spring of 1972, the conversation had mostly moved on. The man who ran the Purina dealership out of Rutledge had said Virgil would be buying the truck back inside of a year. He hadn't said it again since the first green hay appeared in Virgil's barn in July of 1971. The Republic feed route driver had stopped at Virgil's place once in the fall of 1972 to drop off a delivery. Walked over to look at the hay ground through the fence afterward. Didn't say anything. Drove on. He'd been buying hog feed from Virgil's neighbor Raymond Sells for 2 years, which was a connection that didn't need explaining. What people noticed, because they couldn't help noticing, was the hay in the barn, and then the heifers in the field. That was the visible record of what the hogs had done. The hogs themselves were mostly out of sight, working sections 4 through 7 by then, a half-mile back from the county road. What showed from the road was green pasture where there had been thicket, and cattle on grass where there had been briars. The hogs cleared their last section in the fall of 1973. Section 9, the easternmost 8 acres, heavy brush on a north-facing slope that stayed wet into May. 4 years from the first fence post to the last section worked. The total time was 49 months. Not fast, but sustained. A bulldozer would have cost him $800 to $200 to clear that ground. Money he didn't have. The hogs had done it for roots and grubs and 2 pounds of corn a day. He ran the numbers in the composition book, the winter of 1973. He took his time. 2 evenings at the kitchen table with a book and a pencil and the adding machine his mother had left behind. Feed corn. 4 years at an average of 8 animals at 2 pounds per day. Roughly 23,000 pounds of corn total at an average price of $1.80 per hundredweight over that period. Feed cost over the 4 years, approximately $4.15. Veterinary costs, 0. He hadn't called a vet. The hogs were crossbreds with Constitution. In 4 years, he'd lost 2 piglets to a cold snap in the winter of 1971 and 1 gilt to a uterine infection in the fall of 1972. He'd written those losses in the composition book the day they happened. Otherwise, the herd had been healthy. Income from hog sales over the same period, 34 animals sold at an average of $42 each. Gross income, $1,428. Net from the hog operation, not counting his own labor, $113 positive. He had cleared 50 acres, built a breeding herd, generated positive cash flow from animals that did their own clearing, raised their own replacements, and required no equipment he didn't already own, and fed his family pork from October of 1969 through the fall of 1973. Shoulder roasts, ribs, side meat. Sausage Margaret ground herself in the hand grinder bolted to the counter edge. 4 years of pork, in exchange for a 1961 Ford F-100 that had needed a front wheel bearing replaced and was burning about a quart of oil every 200 miles. He didn't miss the truck much. The cleared ground was fully in production by 1975, all 50 acres. The lower sections in hay, fescue and clover, cutting twice a year by then. The upper slope sections he put into a corn rotation. He ran it with an old Farmall H his cousin had sold him for $150 in the spring of 1972. Section 9, the north-facing wet one. He'd left in a grass mix suited to the moisture. He ran the cattle through it on rotational grazing. No point pushing a row crop on ground that stayed muddy until June most years. The 4 Herefords became 9 by 1977. He was selling feeder calves out of Morristown every fall by then. 3 years running. The hog operation had contracted by that point. He kept a breeding pair and a handful of feeders, enough for his own use and the occasional sale. The clearing work was done. He didn't need a clearing herd anymore. His wife, Margaret, had kept her own accounting through this period. She ran the household books and the egg money and the garden receipts in a separate notebook from Virgil's hog ledger. In the fall of 1973, she sat down at the kitchen table, put the 2 notebooks side by side, worked through the numbers from October of 1969 forward. She was not a sentimental woman about money. Numbers were numbers. She calculated the truck's opportunity cost on a scrap of paper before she said anything. A 1961 F-100 in workable condition would have sold for about $350 to $450 in October of 1969. declining maybe $30 a year as it aged. Over 4 years, the resale value would have dropped another $120. Transportation value, she said, at zero. They'd managed 4 years without it by borrowing a neighbor's truck when they needed one and paying in labor for the favor. 4 years of truck, had they kept it? Perhaps $300 in residual value, minus repairs, minus the oil it burned. She told Virgil that the hog operation had produced more value in 4 years than the truck would have produced in 20. She said this once, didn't repeat it, went back to her own book. Virgil wrote it in the margin of the composition book. October 1973. Margaret's assessment. He kept that book until he died. The 4 Herefords became 9 by 1977. He was selling feeder calves out of Morristown every fall. 3 years running of consistent sales off ground that had been thorn thicket 8 years before. The cleared acres produced steadily. Hay in summer, cattle in fall. The rotation tightening each year as the sod thickened and the soil built. He never hired a bulldozer. Never needed to. The work was done by the time he had the money to consider it. Virgil Rhodes farmed the same 90 acres in Granger County until 1994, when his son Dale took over the primary operation. By then, the Herefords were gone. Dale had switched to an Angus cross for easier calving. The hay ground was in its 22nd year of production. The fescue Virgil had overseeded in March of 1971 was still the base stand in 4 of the original cleared sections. Fescue is stubborn that way. Dale sold the farm in 2003. The new owners were a couple from Knoxville. They wanted 10 acres of cleared land for a home site and weren't sure what to do with the rest. The county extension agent walked the property with them. He noted in his visit report that the hay fields showed excellent stand density and soil structure consistent with long-term managed grassland. He wrote that the ground had clearly been well tended. He didn't know about the hogs. Virgil had never replaced the truck. Bought a used '67 Chevy C10 from his neighbor Raymond Sells in the spring of 1970 for $400. Drove it until 1981. By then, the hog operation had paid for itself many times over in cleared ground and sold calves and hay bales and pork on the table. 6 gilts walked home on a lead rope on a Saturday afternoon in October of 1969. Took 2 hours and 20 minutes. 4 miles on the county road. They cleared 50 acres. Fed his family for 4 years while they did it. Built the ground that carried his cattle for 20. The men at the feed store on Route 11 had called it a fool's trade. Most of them drove the same roads they'd always driven, planted the same ground they'd always planted, bought equipment when the bank let them and sold it when they had to. Virgil Rhodes walked home carrying a lead rope and built something that outlasted every one of their opinions.